I love a good icon, don't you? Someone or something to just venerate and look up to. Did you know that originally an icon meant a sort of painting of Jesus Christ? Now though, it's a bit more general. For something to be called iconic, it doesn't really have to be Christian anymore. It just have to be, well, iconic. Over time, the word icon has shifted from religious significance to becoming just something to be venerated, as I mentioned. And we all venerate something, right? We all look up to someone. I'm assuming that if you're a subscriber of me, you probably look up and venerate to me, as you should. And so today, I want to talk about trans icons and whatever that means. Because I think the way we pick people to be icons is a bit wild. But I should say, this isn't one of those trans videos you've heard so much about. This isn't really meant for a trans audience. You can watch this if you are a cis person. In fact, you're the target audience for this video. Congratulations! Something at last for you. Good for you. But actually, I do want to talk about who is allowed to become an icon and why and what that means. It's one of those videos. Who, for the lack of a better term, is allowed to be venerated? Who is allowed to become an icon? And what does veneration even mean in the first place? So to answer that, I'm gonna have to do some things that I don't usually do. First of all, this video is long. I mean, there's a reason it took me 6 weeks to make. And while I've made long videos before, this one is, I think it's special. Secondly, I'm gonna have to do some media analysis, which I haven't really done before, so I hope that you'll bear with me. Typically, I just do discourse analysis with an historical background. If that's something real, go to university, they said. You'll learn valuable skills, they said. Although if the YouTube algorithm is anything to go by, this should just help me in any case. God knows you don't actually have to know media analysis to do media analysis. I'm also gonna have to talk about gossip, for lack of a better term. I mean, discourse is basically just gossip with extra steps. As trans people, we're not really super famous as a subculture, I mean. We don't really dominate the media landscape, so to say. There's not a lot of us out there. What this means is that a lot of the terms used to talk about celebrity in general, I don't really feel can apply to trans people specifically. So the subject for today's video is nebulous. And so the video will have to be a bit nebulous too. So, to start with, let's do an exercise. If you're an audience of mine, imagine a trans woman. Well, okay, except for me. Someone who isn't me. And I know that's hard. And for some of you, this is going to be a slam dunk. Probably for most of you, actually. If you're watching one trans woman on YouTube, you're probably watching someone else too. However, I want to tell you that this is not the case for everyone. If you asked a random person off the street to name a trans woman, I'm not super sure that they would be able to do it. We belong to a subculture, and I'll get into that later in the video. But what that means is that what we know is not necessarily what the mainstream knows. Before I started my very successful career on YouTube, I was an LGBT educator, which basically just meant that I would go around to various parts of local government and tell them that, hey, gay people exist. Did you know? And you can't discriminate against them. Which for many of them was like, yikes. However, this led me to meet all sorts of people. Primarily people who worked in local government, but also people who worked in connection to the people who worked in local government. So there would be teachers, librarians, janitors, construction workers, drivers, truck drivers in general, like all sorts of people. Because part of my job wasn't just to educate government employees, it was to sort of normalize the ideas that gay people exist and there are rules set in place to protect them. I was even once invited to help plan the architecture of a sports arena because of the bathroom issue. I didn't really know what to tell them other than just have enough of them. While doing this work, however, I realized, wow, I'm in a bubble. And I mean like really a bubble. Like we know that we're in a bubble, kind of, but like we are really in a bubble. For almost everyone that I met during this work, as in dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of people, I was the first trans woman that they had ever heard of or met. And that's wild to think about, right? Like, don't you watch the news? Haven't you watched Orange is the New Black? Like, haven't you just picked up of these people just being around on your own by cultural osmosis? And it turns out that didn't really work out that well. And I realized, wow, I'm gonna have to be first contact here. I'm going to have to be the person who introduces this entire new world to these people, to initiate diplomatic relations. And I was not prepared to do that. I was prepared to come in there with my little folder and talk to them about specific discrimination laws. And it turns out that we're gonna have to go down to basics here. And most people meant pretty well, even if they didn't know that much. Like, they wanted to provide a better service, they wanted to be educated, they wanted to, know more generally. Some people didn't think trans people had existed before 2013. Which, fair, that's when I came out. You can be mistaken for thinking that I invented transness, but in fact, I did not. So in this situation, ideally, you would want to sit down with these people over like an entire semester, talking about the history of gender expression and the history of like trans existence and the various natures of trans identities and how gender has been shaped throughout the ages and in various cultural situations. But this was a very limited like course that you could go to that just had like 4 afternoons. You get some coffee and you get a certificate at the end that says like, I know gay stuff now. I am certified to know the gay. So I had to ask my students how to best kind of give them the best initial idea of what transness is. How do you introduce to someone who has never considered the ideas of gender expression or gender identity before that trans people exist? How do you introduce that concept? If they have heard of trans people before, how and where? And have they learned something from that? And why did they learn something from that? So I had to kind of break everything down and kind of find out where they were coming from. And so to create an initial like educational playing field with my students, I had to ask them if they hadn't known of trans people before, where from and how. And so they gave me an insight into how mainstream society viewed trans people. And oh boy, obviously my sample size is slightly flawed. The only people who I talked to were people who wanted to learn about LGBT issues in the first place, so, there's that. But it's still the best experience that I have had to kind of pierce the bubble, so to say. And what I found out was some ideas that might land me in a little bit of hot water with the trans community, because I found out that maybe the Danish Girl is good, actually. So The Danish Girl is a biographical drama made in 2015, but that had been in production since somewhere around 2004. It's directed by Tom Hooper, and it's based on a 2000 book by the same name, which itself is loosely inspired by the very interestingly named book Man into Woman, The First Sex Change, a portrait of Lily Elbe, the true and remarkable transformation of the painter. The movie stars cis man Eddie Redmayne as the transgender main character of Lily Elbe. The movie also stars Alicia Vikander as the arguably second main character of Gerda Wegener. The thing about the main character, Lily Elbe, is that she is typically seen as pretty important in trans history, and is often cited as a sort of early trans pioneer. And for this reason, she's kind of iconized both in mainstream society in terms of trans history, but more specifically in trans culture. Because of this, I feel like the Danish Girl movie kind of acts as a sort of very good example of iconization. It shouldn't surprise you that most trans people I've talked to about this movie have thought that it wasn't great. Like, it hasn't been like the best movie. I mean, we're starting off with the cardinal sin of casting a cis man to play a trans woman. Like, that's a bad. But the movie also plays into a bunch of tropes around trans womanhood. It portrays a very, like, outdated view of transness that doesn't really work. And considering when the movie came out, you could also say that it was kind of commenting on current events, which could also be seen as a bit insensitive. And probably one of the more bad sins is probably that they have taken quite a lot of creative inspiration when depicting an actual historical trans woman who actually existed. I should say though that my opinions on this movie is probably a little bit tainted. The main subject matter is something that I literally studied in university. Linny went to a clinic that was run by Magnus Hirschfeld, which was the focus of like a lot of my studies. So it shouldn't surprise you then that when I heard that this movie was going to be made, I reacted with glee, being like, oh shit, they're making the movie of that I studied. Like, I studied this, now they're making it. Like, holy shit. And secondly, I almost got a part in the movie. I think it was in 2013 when they started doing like some casting for it, and I just saw a Tumblr post, because Tumblr was important back then, talking about like, hey, looking for trans people who can like play in this movie. And I was like, yes, this is the movie, this is what I've studied. I live close to Denmark where they're gonna shoot. I thought maybe they did, I should know that. And I figured out like, okay, I can do that. I can just do that. And so I was actually a little bit in contact with like the casting director of the movie, and like we talked about me potentially going to do it. Then didn't happen. I mean, honestly, even in the best case scenario, I wouldn't have gotten it anyway. And honestly, this isn't even close to getting anything. I sent an application, they asked for some clarification, and then they told me no. Yeah, that's not really nearly getting it, is it? But also a missed opportunity, because if they cast me, I'm sure people would have liked the movie a lot better. Anyway, the movie comes out in 2015 to like okay-ish reviews, but since people love it, like people talk about it like a lot, it seems that's very innovative because this is a movie about trans people that is kind of celebratory of trans people in a sort of weird way. First of all, we rarely get to see trans people in media at all, so just seeing like a movie about trans people, wow, that's unique in itself. That's just progressive all over. The Oscars will love it. But also, it was a very Hollywood movie. Trans people have existed in Hollywood and in media forever, but to have the trans people be a sympathetic subject matter in a big movie made fairly recently with a big budget with like high names involved in it, like that was a pretty big deal. And as I mentioned, the movie is obviously Oscar bait, so they wanted to get some Oscars. And because we live in a society where basically anything that actually finishes production is almost assured a success, if they didn't just bungle it up entirely. Anyway, the movie comes out, the cis, they like it. Eddie was nominated for an Oscar. Alicia Vikander actually wins an Oscar from it. And while that doesn't necessarily mean that people like it, it is definitely a sign that the movie is a hashtag big deal. Now, I'm not a movie critic, so I'm not going to talk about the movie too much, except to say that I think the acting is vapid, the cinematography is unoriginal, as is the musical score, the writing is tolerable at best, and the entire aesthetic of the movie just screams Oscar bait, and honestly, the movie isn't even about the Danish girl in question, it's about her wife. The movie got a fair amount of criticism for basically focusing its main story arc on a secondary character, Lily's wife. Gerda Wegener was the wife of Lily Alba. It should be noted that her own art was pretty famous at the time, and it's kind of a shame that her current memory is, I would say, kind of primarily based on her relationship with Lily. The Danish Girl movie really does not treat her memory very well. Gerda in real life drew lesbian erotic art, maintained a relationship with Lily until the annulment of their marriage, and has unfortunately been sort of relegated as a subheader in a trans narrative. And she has over 50% of the screen time in the movie, which qualifies her as a main character. And in effect, this sort of means that a large part of the movie isn't really about the main character. And while we do get to see this kind of evolution of gender identity and womanhood in trans people, I would say we don't actually primarily see it from the point of view of the main character. We see it from the point of view of the wife, who acts as a sort of audience stand-in, and more specifically, a cis stand-in. Whenever there's a concept that needs to be explained to the audience in order to kind of understand the transness of it all, it is communicated to the audience through the wife. The wife is cis, the wife is straight, the wife is, by most accounts, normal. And as so, acts very well as a stand-in to the audience. So the actual main character is the wife, who has to kind of suffer through the trauma of having a partner transition and explore their sexuality and gender identity, while the main character, the wife, the actual main character, just wants to have a normal, happy married life. And so, all of the trans ideas that are presented in the movie are presented through a cis framework for a cis audience. And again, the movie got a lot of criticism for this, but it also made the movie more understandable to cis people. But sort of accidentally, the movie does one thing kind of right. Sort of, if you stretch it a little bit. I want to be fair and balanced here, so I'm gonna give a little bit for benefit of the movie. Most importantly, perhaps, is that the ideas around gender and gender expression are presented very cliche-like, or very simplified. So while it's kind of out of place by the standards of today, it's not that out of place compared to the era that it's actually set within. So the specific events in the movie might be a bit false, as in they fabricate characters, they add unnecessary drama in the two characters' relationship, and there's just a general historical mess. That's not historically accurate. But ideologically, it kind of is. At the historical time, there wasn't this super clear difference between trans people and people who were cross-dressing. That didn't really happen yet, and a large part of that is because medical transitioning wasn't an option for almost anyone. And in those early days, the idea of gender was very connected to genitals. If you had the surgery, you were the gender. Do you have the junk? Then you are the trunk. Basically, if you have the surgery, you become the gender. And the movie sort of plays with these ideas a little bit. And, that would be great if the entire audience was also historians who focused specifically on sexual history in Germany in the early 1900s. I'm guessing, though, that that's probably not most people. But for my students at the time, this was their first entry to it, and they had an easy time understanding it. Probably because they were pretty easy simplified ideas. The ideas that we have around transgender identity today, they build upon these older, outdated ideas too. So when I taught LGBT awareness to this class of mainstream people, they understood this basic Hollywood idea of transness. And that gave us a playing field that we could build on. And it was certainly better than nothing. Perhaps even more importantly, these ideas were presented in such a non-hostile and simple way that even people who were outright hostile to LGBT rights could kind of get it from watching this movie. And sure, they're not gonna get 400 pages of queer feminist theory, but they will kind of get that oh, this is who I am on the inside. I am a woman. Oh. So the icon that I want to talk about is both the idea of Lily Elba, but also the historical person of Lily Elba. In the trans community, Lily is venerated a little bit. Whenever people talk about historical trans people, Lily is first on the list. The individual of Lily Elba was very different from what we see in the Hollywood movie. The individual of Lily Elba is someone who is often venerated in the trans community as a sort of trans pioneer. And some people were angry that the movie had taken such creative liberty with her portrayal. This was an actual trans person, and the movie kind of Hollywoodized everything, repackaged an actual person into a sort of product for cis people to watch. But the idea of her is probably much more powerful than the individual, even in the trans community. And I noticed that a lot of the people in my class at the time kind of knew a little bit about Lily Alba already, just probably picking up from friends talking about the movie or promotional material or something like that. She was in the zeitgeist, so to say. And I wondered why Lily was seen as so iconic. Why is Lily the person who is, the person you make a Hollywood movie about, the person who mainstream society can kind of connect to when it comes to like historical trans people? And I think there's a lot of different reasons. First of all, the idea of Lily is someone who conforms easily. This is a man, wants to be a woman, wants to become pregnant, feminine, works in a feminine job, does the feminine thing, is straight, all of that thing, She wants to do the surgery. In fact, she wants to do the surgery so bad, she wants to become pregnant. Like, holy shit. When we talk about conforming trans people, Lily's the queen. But also, she's not political, is she? She just wants to fit in. Her story also starts from an already kind of famous starting point. Lily was an accomplished artist long before she transitioned. Lily and Gerda were both established artists before Lily transitioned. So that helps, Famous people transitioning, they become even more famous, When have we ever seen that happen before? It even became a small scandal at the time that this happened, which probably helps raise someone to levels of fame. But why is she an icon in the purely trans historical sense? I haven't really seen that many people talk about Lily Alba's art. Almost everyone who venerates or iconizes her does so because she is trans woman pioneer. Like that's the crux of the issue. So why her? And I think everyone sort of has this thought early on when they think about why we think about Lily. And I've seen many people kind of explain away with like, well, she was the first trans woman to have the surgery. But she wasn't, though. Another woman was. A woman called Dora Richter. And the thing is, outside of purely academic circles, I had never heard anyone talk about Dora. Despite being the first trans woman ever to undergo such a pioneering surgery, which honestly is very culturally important in trans woman culture, we can't ignore that. Why doesn't no one know who she is? And I don't really buy the whole Lily was an artist thing. Lily was famous and therefore became even more famous. I don't really buy that. To me, that sort of sounds like someone actually landed on the moon before Neil Armstrong, but Neil Armstrong gets all the credit because he was already famous beforehand. Like, what? Of course not. Being the first is always something monumental. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. But you gotta admit, it is a bit strange. My theory so far is twofold. I think that in order for an icon to be created, they have to be simple. That's not to say that Lily's life was any less complicated or deep as Dora Richter's, but the idea of Lily Alba as a troubled artist doing her best to become herself, having to leave her wife, undergoing surgery and dying in the process, it's a simple story. It's a nice flowing narrative. It has a beginning, it has an uncomplicated ending, it is sort of bittersweet. It's a good story, it's a simple story. That shit appeals to the minds of mainstream society. And also to us. But of course it's not true. That story of Lily's life has been brutally oversimplified in over 100 years of telling and retelling, different types of accounts, different types of interpretations on those accounts. That story doesn't exist and has never existed because no person ever operates like that. And the thing is, Lily would never be as famous as she is if it wasn't for mainstream attention. And I would argue that the events of Dora's life definitely deserve, like, the blockbuster treatment. So let's talk about Dora's life for once. She, much like Lily, went to the Institute for Sexual Research run by Magnus Hirschfeld, where she even got a job and eventually, underwent the surgery. It is unfortunately presumed that her story ends in 1933 when Nazis attack the Institute. Oh. See, as I mentioned, we don't want our icons complicated. And we definitely don't want them politically complicated. The entire history of trans surgery and a lot of trans medicine and trans culture originating in an event that eventually led to death by Nazi, that's complicated. And we don't do complicated. We do need to talk about icons and what it means to be venerated. And I feel the best way to do that is kind of to boil things down to simplicity and something that is a bit more relatable. So to do that, we need to talk even more about subcultures. While you could argue that a lot of the ideas presented in the Danish Girl movie are better than nothing, you can also argue that they might do more harm than good. To someone who has absolutely no idea about any sort of trans issues, the Danish Girl is somewhat of an introduction. But because there's no mainstream media to kind of develop that, it kind of just solidifies outdated and frankly controversial ideas about gender. In the minds of modern trans people then, who typically have some more modern ideas about transness, the movie will always be outdated and poorly representative. So, depending on how you look at the movie, you'll have a very different take on how it sort of shapes your impression of transness in the first place. The difference here is a difference of subcultural viewpoints. In mainstream society that may not have the best view on trans people, you're gonna have one take on the movie. But as trans people, we belong to a subculture, and that subculture is, a bit more informed regarding trans issues, and therefore it's gonna have a different take on the movie. But because we belong to this kind of subculture that probably has a bit more complex idea around gender and gender expression, it also allows us to imagine more versions of those things. And this leads me to talking about decompartmentalizing icons. If you're already pretty aware of gender issues, you're probably gonna be aware of many different trans people that belong to many different subcultures. However, if you know nothing, all you maybe know is that one trans. Early on in my own transition, the trans icons that I had access to was, for example, Andrea Pejic, who was a supermodel who came out as trans, and because my subculture at the time was fashion related, that's kind of who I was drawn to. Similar things can happen if you are taking part of sort of online or YouTube-based subcultures. Mainstream society may have no idea who, for example, Blair White is, but if you're watching this video, I'm not surprised if you do. And the thing is about awareness, for most of the 21st century so far, mainstream society wasn't really aware of trans issues at all, until fairly recently, which leads me into talking about the transgender tipping point. When, according to the media, trans as a concept stopped being this underground hidden thing that no one talked about and suddenly became a thing. Suddenly it became too normal to ignore. We couldn't just not have any trans people around anymore. We actually had to acknowledge trans people existing. Which, of course, leads me to Caitlyn Jenner. In any conversation about icons, we kind of have to talk about Caitlyn Jenner. There's no avoiding it. And I mean, speaking of complicated, right? Speaking of political. Eesh. So, outside of the Danish Girl, Probably the most common response that I would hear from my students about what trans people have you seen in the world was almost, like by a large majority, Caitlyn Jenner. Why Caitlyn Jenner? Well, we've already seen some arguments around Lily Elba, so let's talk about Caitlyn Jenner instead. Obviously, Caitlyn was pretty famous in her own right, and also connected to some very famous people. Much like the Danish Girl, a lot of trans people that I talked to about Caitlyn Jenner, especially at the time, did not like her. And there were a myriad of reasons as to why Caitlyn Jenner should not be famous. People said she's rich. She can just pay her way through her transition and she doesn't really have to suffer the way that we have. On the other hand, she said some pretty yikes things in the early parts of coming out, which, you know, okay, people have opinions. I'm not going to go into that. People can have their opinions. But, like it or not, Caitlyn became part of the mainstream. And because of that, she has become a sort of trans icon. Caitlyn has received numerous rewards and talked at length about trans identity, although arguably she's just another trans woman who hasn't really done too much in the cause of transness, except for when it comes to awareness. Awareness is a tricky thing. People will say that spreading awareness is sometimes a good thing on its own, completely devoid of context. Some people would say that we need context, otherwise awareness can just put a target on people's backs. I would argue that Caitlyn, regardless of her intentions, she didn't really have a choice. She was famous, people definitely put a lot of spotlight on her, and when she came out, that's just how it had to be. Granted, I wish she had better politics, but that's me. But I should also mention that, like, it is hard to understate just how big the sort of media bonanza around Caitlyn was before she transitioned, or at least came out publicly. I remember tabloids and news constantly for weeks talking about the latest rumors, sightings of Caitlyn wearing like nail polish, these like extremely weird fascinations around a person potentially transitioning. And when it finally came out that she was transitioning, holy shit. The media landscape was not kind to her, honestly. And, frankly, she kind of took it in stride. And again, a bit uninformed. But you know, we've all been there. We've all been baby transes. You know, maybe not to the point of supporting Donald Trump, but still. However, I did say that icons aren't supposed to be political. And she definitely is. Or at least was. Maybe she still is. I don't really keep up that much. But remember, there's a difference between the idea of someone and the actual individual. The individual of Caitlyn Jenner, very political, probably not that representative of the larger trans community, has some yikes takes, is weird politically, you know, whatever. But the idea of Caitlyn Jenner, oh, that's a different beast. Again, huge media flurry, everyone talking about it, athlete coming out, making big names, connected with like the super rich, the super famous, has her own TV show talking about like transgender identity, talking about the early stages of transitioning, the ideas fermenting in the mind of someone who is early in their transition, but arguably a bit late in life. It's a story. It's a story that is easy to kind of take in by the mainstream. And remember, I talked to mainstream society. A lot of the people I talked to as part of the courses were pretty right-wing. And had we lived in America, would probably vote for Donald Trump. So, she's not that political in the zeitgeist. Outside of supporting Donald Trump, she hasn't really done that much politically. Which, in the minds of people that want trans people to look up to, is easy to internalize, it's easy to accept. There doesn't have to be a lot of mental friction when it comes to accepting a person as an icon, when you don't have to think about them politically at all. In a weird way then, people matter more as icons because they don't matter that much politically. Because of this, Caitlyn, like many other trans women, are famous almost exclusively because of their transness. Yes, granted. Olympic gold medal winner. Yes, that's the initial staging point. But she's not famous today because she won gold medals before. She's relevant today because she's trans, and because she came out as trans in a very public way. As trans people, we are a subculture, arguably of the LGBT community, but also of mainstream society. And because of that, we are not that many. There's not a lot of us out there. And I remember distinctly back in 2012, when I started transitioning, that I didn't know of a single trans woman at all. Never heard of one. The first trans woman I even knew was me. And it was like that for like a year, which is far too long. And here's the thing. Our community is still, today, despite increased visibility and everything, small. Compared to cis people, they outnumber us. So whenever a trans person becomes famous, their transness will become part of that sustained fame. If you look at trans people who are culturally around, including myself, a lot of that has to do with how we can monetize our own transness. And I think this is the case for basically every single trans icon out there. Lily, who we discussed earlier, isn't necessarily famous because she was a trans pioneer, or because she was an artist before her time. She's famous because a family member wrote down her memoirs and published a book. And so while she didn't monetize her own transness, someone else certainly did. Caitlyn Jenner turned her entire trans identity into a pretty successful brand. I Am Kate is actually, weirdly enough, probably one of the most significant cultural impacts that trans people have had in the world at all. Which is kind of uncomfortable to say because, like, I don't really like Caitlyn Jenner either. So here's the rub. So I can't talk about this without feeling that there's a kind of level of tokenism here. That in order to become a mainstream icon, you kind of have to become the token trans, in the mindset of whoever you want to appeal to. Caitlyn Jenner definitely appeals to the kind of upper class or middle class, kind of right-wing center population who they see trans people, but they want them to like conform and, you know, act like normal people. Lily definitely feels a slot of someone who is like an historical trans woman, and because we now have one to fill that slot, we don't think about it anymore. Which is probably another reason why we don't think about Dora. We already have our historical Tran. And this is an example of when decompartmentalization can go wrong. And probably an example of the most common type of decompartmentalization around trans people. And I feel like this manifests itself not only in big mainstream society, but also in subcultures and subcultures of subcultures. So even amongst trans people ourselves, within our little bubble, I feel like this tokenism still acts in play. So, conclusions. The problem about being a very small community is that we end up having to like play a numbers game. We want people to venerate. We want celebrities. We want people to be up there that we can kind of look up to, strive to be better than, or become, or however you want to see your icons as. The problem, as I mentioned, is that there aren't that many of us. So we become sort of perfectionists. We aren't allowed to have imperfect heroes. And so the people who become iconized also become simplified, which doesn't help when we kind of have to take what we can get when it comes to celebrity. And while this often happens by mainstream society, we don't really do that much to correct it either, because it works in our interest. I feel like there is a big overlap between an icon and a celebrity, but I feel that they are slightly different. We do sort of accept that celebrities are imperfect and, you know, just human beings, but an icon is something that lasts. You don't just become an icon overnight, you have to ingrain yourself deeply into the mindset of mainstream society. And because there are so few trans icons, the ones that do exist become so quickly. You don't really have a lot of competition to work with. A consequence of this, though, is that there's a lot of veneration that goes into a few amount of individuals. So trans icons have to be more perfect, more simple, more beautiful, and just more iconic. And this leads people to place trans icons on a pedestal, which is a disservice both to them and to basically everyone else who could also be on the pedestal. The only solution I see here is that we need to kind of ramp up production of trans icons. We need more of us. And while this is sort of an issue of representation, that's not really where the crux of the issue is. We need to find more icons so that the ones who are being represented are also being represented more fairly. It's better to have many flawed icons than a few that you force to be perfect. I can't make a video talking about trans icons without mentioning maybe like the OG trans icons. We have to talk about Stonewall. Becoming venerated as an icon is something that maybe is seen as something worthy or honored, but in fact, it's not really that at all. As I mentioned several times before, it is simply a process of simplification. When we're talking about Stonewall, there's a lot of talk about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. But remember the idea of Stonewall. The idea of Stonewall is that a lot of trans people of color got really angry at the police who was trying to raid the Stonewall Inn. They threw some bricks at some cops and a riot started. And there's been a lot of arguing about who threw the first brick at Stonewall. But the thing is, there was probably no one who threw a brick at Stonewall. And when we're talking about people like Marsha P. Johnson, definitely an icon in the LGBT community and definitely a trendsetter and super important person for the community, she didn't really describe herself as transgender. And you can argue, yes, that's because the terminology wasn't really up there yet. But at the same time, we can't really ascribe an identity to someone that we don't really know identified with it in the first place. Which is why it's more accurate to refer to Marsha P. Johnson as a drag queen, because that's how she's self-identified. But the trans idea of Stonewall doesn't usually deal with that. And as mentioned earlier, while this is political in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to LGBT history, the things that happened at Stonewall aren't really controversial, so to say, despite the fact that a lot of it is just potentially pure fabrication. The problem here is that these people, and all the other people that I mentioned throughout this video, become oversimplified. And the history of these people also is reduced somewhat to an idea rather than an individual. And while that's fine on some levels for a very base level understanding, for example, to talk to my students over a 4-hour class, for a community as a whole, I think we need more than that. We can't just survive in a community that looks up to false ideas and oversimplifications. We need a lot more than that. And how do we get there? I have no idea. Maybe we need more icons. Maybe we need to churn out Hollywood movies about trans people. Maybe that's how we have to do it. I don't know. And you know, if you want to talk about icons, or maybe if you want to be an icon, something that would probably help with that is to, build up your own skill set. Learn things. And you know who can help with that? My sponsor for this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creators, entrepreneurs, and curious people everywhere. You can take classes in creativity, filmmaking, design, for example, filmmaking from home, where you can learn the skills to become a filmmaker without having to use a camera or crew. Normally the price for Skillshare is less than $10 a month, but the first 1,000 people that use the link in the description will get access to Skillshare Premium for free for 2 months. I'd like to give special thanks to Aini Salminen, Alicia Crawford, Amalia, Amanda B, Athiet, Austin K, Autumn, Catherine Stenson, Charlie, Christine Gutierrez, Cobra Sphere, Dana Ferguson, Emil Rutkowski, Emily Rains, Emma Not Goldman, Fox Kant, Huang Wu, Jane Lusby, Janelle Torgesson, Jörgen Danielsen, Josie Volps, Kitchens, LPQ Silver, Linus 2.0, Morimer, Mountain Snow, MSG, Nia Pasaka, Nork 426, Patrick Stack, Phobos2390, Rosie, Riley Knox, Sophie Huck, Scary Sun, Sitzrees, Thoros of Myr, Tiffany A, Travis Chauvin, William Fu Hustle, Uncle Cheese, Vinder, Vivian Crow, William Spencer, Wolfgang the Grand High Exalted Wizard,